Welcome to From the Logo, the Scores NBA show. I'm your host, Joseph Casciaro, joined in studio, as I am every other week, by Scott Campsall. Scott, what's going on?
What's up, buddy? Excited to talk about some trades today.
Oh, baby. We were originally going to talk about Trae Young's virtually non-existent trade market, and instead, we have a trade to discuss that proves how non-existent that trade market was, because Trae Young's 7.5-year run in Atlanta has come to an end with a trade to the Washington Wizards for CJ McCollum's expiring contract, Corey Kispert, and that's it.
That's it.
No picks. And in fact, there was, some reporting and murmuring that if there was going to be draft pick compensation in this deal, it might have actually been going from Atlanta to Washington as a sweetener to take Trae Young's contract. So, Trae Young's a Wizard, CJ McCollum and Corey Kispert are Hawks. Virtually no one else in the league wanted Trae Young. Let's talk about it. What are your immediate thoughts?
My immediate thoughts are fascinating trade. So many different kind of elements to it that I'm sure we'll get into. But I think obviously the headline is you look at this trade, Trae Young is, this isn't a 35-year-old guy at the end of his career. This is a multiple-time All-Star, a former All-NBA player, 27 years old, getting traded for, and essentially a salary dump. It is. You look at it at face value and it is just shocking, I think digging into it, which we will, it's a little less shocking. But I think for a lot of us, Trae Young, dynamic offensive player, puts up incredible stats, the assist leader in the NBA last season. Mm-hmm. I think specters of that 2021 conference finals are still looming large for a lot of us. Just an elite offensive player that, in the last 3-4 years hasn't led to any success for his team. So it's kind of once you start peeling back the layers a little bit, it starts to make a little bit more sense.
Yeah, the story of Trae Young is, listen, since that 2021 conference finals run you mentioned, he's averaged roughly 26 points and 11 assists since then in 4 years. Incredible numbers, right? The Hawks during that time have averaged 40 wins. So 2 games under 500 for a season on average. They have barely won Trae Young's minutes in the 4 years since. They're plus 0.5 per 100. And then this year, now the excuse this year is that he's been hobbled. He's been in and out of the lineup with knee and quad injuries. But still, this year, 2-8 with him, 16-13 without him. Much better, even when you look at the net rating and stuff without him. That's the story of Trae Young. It's that this dynamic offensive player that you mentioned, this really, really gifted offensive player and special playmaker, can put up these offensive numbers and do what he does, and it doesn't lead to winning. And I'll add as well that the Hawks have spent much of those last 4 years trying to improve the defensive infrastructure around him because they know his limitations. And despite those attempts, combined with Trae Young's offensive numbers, they still haven't been able to be anything but mediocre at best. And that is the story of Trae Young. Now, the obvious thing to talk about would be the devastating flaw that is his defense. Perennially one of, if not the worst defensive players in the league. And I know there are people out there that will say there are a lot of stars that don't play defense. Luka Doncic, who got traded last year among them. There are other guys. The difference is Luka Doncic is a big, strong dude. And so him not trying on defense, I'm not excusing it. It's terrible. But there are certain things in basketball size can just make up for. Trae Young's a, bad defensive guy from an effort perspective. It's inconsistent at best. Who also happens to be, generously listed at 6'2" and 164. He's small, he's wiry. When you combine that with no lateral quickness and a lack of effort, it's abysmal on that end. Before I turn the mic back over to you, though, what I'll say is that's usually the story with Trae, and that is the big story, and that's why his teams have had trouble winning despite his offensive numbers. But the thing I will add, and the thing people gloss over too often, is that his offense is also not as flawless as it would need to be to mitigate those defensive concerns. And I wrote about this yesterday on the Score app. People should check out my article reacting to this trade. But when Trae Young was a prospect in Oklahoma and early in his career, that conference finals run, the range he could shoot from, all this stuff, he got a lot of comparisons to Steph Curry, right? A young Steph Curry. And I always said he is more like a poor man's James Harden than he is anything like Steph Curry. The difference is James Harden, pick all the flaws in his game you want, at his best was an elite driver of winning. And between his shooting and the foul drawing was always a super, super efficient player. James Harden's career true shooting percentage is over 60. 12 out of his 17 seasons, he's been a 60-plus true shooting percentage guy. Trae's been that once in 8 years, and has actually been a below average efficiency guy in half of his seasons. So, like, that's kind of the dirty secret here. This terrible defensive player was supposed to be an offensive superstar, might not even be that.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head right there, I think. I think everyone's going to talk about how he is just disastrous defensively. But I mean, and especially to your point about Atlanta, they have spent the last few years getting guys like Dyson Daniels that are, try to overcome. Like, I think if you want to look to a team like the Knicks, who also aren't amazing defensively, but, they've got a guy like Jalen Brunson who is undersized. In order for it to work, he has to be as efficient as a Jalen Brunson, which, clearly they're on two different levels at this point, which if you had said that 5 years ago would sound insane also. But yes, the efficiency, it's like you think, we have all these images in our head of like logo Trae, but it's like his shooting percentage has been like, especially from three, has been dipping. And I think this year's shooting, again, with all the injuries, like 30% from three or something.
For his career, he's like 35. It's like average-ish three-point shooting.
Average at best. And it's like, if you're going to be such a liability on the other end, you have to do something, Steph Curry's so great because he's such a good three-point shooter. He adjusts the defense and that changes the way you can play. Trae doesn't do that, so it's just, you can't be bad at these two things, like you can't be inefficient and bad defensively because especially if you are the anchor of the team.
Right. Like
what it requires to have Trae Young maximize his potential means basically dominating your offense. It just doesn't work if he can't do it. It's like what he does best doesn't work because he's not efficient enough.
Exactly.
And like, it's just, the Hawks legitimately tried. I kind of think, you can make the argument, it's crazy because this, your perception of this trade kind of varies widely depending on how much attention you're paying. But you can make the argument the Hawks got off great because they got off of his contract, got an expiring deal back, and they get another guy and didn't have to give up any draft capital, right, which, was being thrown out there. So I just think the reaction to this trade is so fascinating because it's so widely. Like you go from like, I can't believe that this 27-year-old All-Star got traded for basically nothing to, wow, the Hawks actually made it out okay because they got an expiring contract back.
It's crazy. It speaks to a lot of things, and we can get into some of like the cap and the apron stuff too. But yeah, like if you're more of a casual fan in the NBA and someone said, yeah, a 4-time All-Star reigning assist champion at 27 years old got moved for this package, you'd be like, what? But again, when you consider all the things we talked about, and it's like I mentioned the whole thing about poor man's Harden. It's think of all the flaws people pick in Harden's game. Now imagine if he was smaller, weaker, worse defensively somehow, and way less efficient. Like it's just in the modern NBA, in the age of aprons, when teams are starting to wise up about how they allocate their resources, you probably can't win, almost surely can't win, if 30% of your cap is being taken up like by a guy like Trae Young, who is, at his best, an all-star, an all-NBAer once, but that was 4 years ago. But at his best, not like an inner circle, top tier championship deciding superstar. He's not that. And those you can't overpay second tier stars, flawed stars like Trae anymore, and build a sustainable contender. And that's why I think the Hawks were happy to let him go for what they did. What I think too, people are kind of losing sight of is Corey Kispert. Obviously, I'm not going to say he's going to be a future star or anything, but talking about those aprons, I think what people have to start doing is looking at contracts in terms of like percentage of the cap that they take up and not so much the raw number. Kispert is probably just going to be a solid shooter with size off the bench for his entire career. But guess what? At 7% of the salary cap through 2029, at 26 years old, that's a nice pickup to add to a team that's got Jalen Johnson. No, Jalen Johnson's defense is its own conversation we can have another day, but tremendous young offensive star on a crazy bargain of a contract that is never even going to be 20% of the cap. Dyson Daniels, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, the pick coming from either New Orleans or Milwaukee, the best of those two teams, first-round pick this year, which could be a top-tier pick in a loaded draft class. Atlanta is really trending upwards all of a sudden. On the flip side, the Wizards, you can clown them for this in the sense where you can be like, well, you just said it's hard to build a perennial contender with a guy like Trae. They're not necessarily interested right now in being a contender. They are long-term, they want to get to that, and that's why they're rebuilding. But I actually think for everything we've said, and it probably, if you only watch the first 5 minutes of this, you're going to think we're the biggest Trae Young haters in the world. But I still appreciate what he can bring to a team and what he can bring to a rebuilding Wizards team. Like, he is still an elite playmaker. He can positively affect your offense, obviously. And he can still warp defenses in a way where, like, we mentioned the average shooting, but teams are affected by the very threat of his jumper. So, like, he can still bring positive gains to the Wizards. Offense, some of their young guys like Sarr and Koulibaly and Trey Johnson are going to get the best looks they've ever had with Trey passing them the ball. Also, I think there are some parallels to the Brandon Ingram deal last year where it's like the Raptors traded for a guy when his value was low. He was hurt at the time, so he didn't affect their ability to tank or prioritize lottery odds because they could slow play the return from injury. The Wizards pick is only top 8 protected. I think there are ways where the Wizards could be looking at next year having Trae Young, a great defensive prospect in Alex Sarr, some other interesting young players, and a top-tier prospect. And then all of a sudden, you're looking up.
Sure, yeah. I mean, great breakdown, by the way. Very thorough. Left me with very little to talk about. Washington I think these two teams are in a very interesting spot because I think Atlanta and Washington are both teams that have spent the last few years, stockpiling draft picks, trading for young players. I think Atlanta, because Trey has been out this year and because they are a few years along, they got to have a look at what they got and they think, you know what? Trey doesn't fit here anymore. We've got a bunch of these guys, like Okongwu is another guy that I think, some real potential for them. And Washington on the other side also has been, as you mentioned, Sarr, Koulibaly, Bub, a lot of these guys where they are actually playing pretty well as of late. There's some potential there. So why not take a flyer on a guy where, again, like you basically traded, CJ McCollum, who was an expiring contract that you got for this reason.
Yep.
And then a rotation player that is, depends on what you think of Corey Kispert, but he probably maxes out as a rotation player. So why not take a shot? We've got all these young guys. We're building towards something. We're completing this massive list that started with, I think, Bradley Beal and ends after a trade. You get Chris Paul, you get Russell Westbrook, you got all these guys. You end up with Trae Young. Like, why not give that a shot? You don't have to extend him. Probably opts into his contract next year. Gives you a chance to have a look at what this team looks like with all these young guys and then a veteran that has the potential to, dominate the game offensively. And guess what? Like, he's led the Hawks to, it's a battle of expectations. The Hawks making the play-in 4 years in a row, not great for the Hawks. If the Wizards made the play-in for the next 2-3 years, that's pretty great for them. So,
The Wizards, to your point, have been irrelevant for most of the last decade. They haven't, like I mentioned, how mediocre the Hawks were with or without Trey, like averaging 40 wins the last 4 years. The Wizards haven't won even 40 games in a season in 8 years. They haven't won a playoff series in 9 years. The Washington Wizards haven't won 50 games in a season or advanced to the conference finals since 1979. So not all these things are created equal.
Absolutely.
One team's mediocrity is another team's version of thriving.
Yes.
If the Wizards could get to a point where they were a consistent 40-ish win team in the mix for a play-in, and I'm not saying that's their long-term goal. It obviously isn't. They want to build a sustainable contender. But if they can take the jump from where they are now to that level of being a 40-ish win, maybe play-in contender next year without it affecting their lottery odds this year, like if they can do that with Young and Sarr and another good young player, that's all of a sudden something you can build on. It doesn't, like, being a 40-win playing team doesn't have to mean you're stuck in the middle if you have the right mix of talent and young players. So I completely understand this move from Washington's perspective. I will like it a lot better if they could actually get Trey to extend on like the Ingram type deal. The Raptors got him to extend to within a few days of that trade, like 120, 40-ish million for Trey. People can still say it's an overpay, but at like 20 to 25% of the cap over the next few years, I'm fine with that for where Washington is. I think it's perfectly reasonable that Washington made this move, and I think it's completely justifiable that Atlanta was willing to let Trey walk for nothing, and that's what makes Trae Young and this deal so fascinating, and that's what will make extension talks between the Wizards and Trey so fascinating.
Oh yeah, like this feels to me like a Brandon Ingram deal in more ways than one. Like I think this feels to me like he plays sparingly, if at all, for the Wizards the rest of the way. Try to like run the young guys, see what you have, keep the pick, most importantly. I feel like if I'm Trey, I'm probably playing out next season in hopes that I can get a larger contract in the summer. But dude, free agency is crazy now. Like, you're not seeing a lot of guys moving free agency. You're not seeing a lot of teams opening up cap space because of just like the aprons and everybody trying to figure out these salaries. And I think this is definitely, to your point, in terms of the aprons, one of what I think will be like one of the first big moves where we start to see like really the shift, because his next contract will be fascinating.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think because of the aprons, you're really going to have to start seeing like a separation between like the tippy top elite players, you know, your SGAs, you know, Lukas, and then that next tier of guys, which are still, again, Trae Young, super decorated player, you know, in terms of like personal accolades, individual accolades. Like if he's a guy that can no longer get the max, that is a like huge recalibration of the entire free agency system.
And that's what I think we're looking at right now. Great point. All right, so last thing, you know what I think will actually be really funny? Not so much for Wizards fans, but if a few months from now we're sitting here and talking about like the lottery, and it's like the Wizards finish with, I don't know, the second worst record or something and end up with like the 4th or 5th pick in a draft that everyone thinks has 3 future stars, and the Hawks get one of those other 3.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like very possible that'll happen because they have double the odds between getting one of Milwaukee or New Orleans' best picks. So
that's right.
I think the what I'd read today was if you combine those two teams' odds right now, since they would get the best, it's like 15%, which is actually more than the worst team in the league would get. So
yeah, that's fascinating too. The trade has so many different little elements. Like I could talk about it for, you know, another 45 minutes. Probably.
We definitely could, but I think for the time being, we've exhausted it.